Boom, 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 boom. A side, B side, what side are you on?
Have you ever thought to yourself, man, I sure would like to make a podcast. I've got so much to say about blank. Well, if you haven't heard about Anchor, you really should. It is the easiest way to make a podcast, and it's absolutely free. All right, I'm going to tell you why it's so easy. Okay, so with Anchor, there's creation tools that allows you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many others. And you can even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Trust me, I'm so excited about this. You can be too. Download the free Anchor app or go to Anchor FM to get started. Hey, desktop detectives. Welcome back to another episode of A-Side, B-Side podcast. Brooke Summers here, flying solo this week. Adam has some personal issues, so he is taking the week off. Adam, we hope that everything is okay. Before we get into things, want to say thank you to our friends in California, over in Oakland and Carlsbad, also in Georgia. Thanks for listening in LaGrange and Winder. Forgive me, I'm sorry. I've never been there, but I would love to come visit. Also in Nebraska and Omaha, thanks for listening. Plymouth, New Hampshire, love ya over there. Overseas, thanks to our friends in Hordaland, Norway. I'd love to come there. Also Lombardy, Italy, thanks for listening. In Canada, our neighbors to the north, love Canada. You know, Buffalo is so close to Canada that all my New York City friends would always joke, you know, you're like from Canada. It's okay. I like Canada. What's up in Manitoba? Also, hello over in North Sumatra, Indonesia. Thank you so much for listening to A-Side, B-Side podcast. If you like the show, there's several ways that you can support the show. You can buy us a coffee. It's buymeacoffee.com/A-Side, B-Side pod. You can also buy merch. We've got brand new merch. Bad Vibes Save Lives. It's a cute little t-shirt. I love it. I am waiting on mine to arrive. Also, a mask that says that as well. Also, Trust Your Guts. They're probably nuts tea because, you know, those guts, those vibes, they can tell you when something is happening. Listen, don't apologize. It's okay to think somebody's a creep because they're probably a creep. As of this recording, lots of things happening in the state. So we'll start with the rally of Trump supporters in D.C. that turned into the protest of the vote confirmation. And we know that at that rally, Trump was calling on Pence to reject the Electoral College results, something that Pence legally can't even do. Supporters then Trump called for action, and supporters began storming the Capitol, clashing with police while holding Blue Lives Matter flags, but fighting with Capitol Police. They got into the building. They got into various offices. They stole objects. Someone stole mail from Nancy Pelosi's desk. Stealing mail from anyone is a federal crime. In the ensuing chaos, we know 5 people. We first found out about one female that had died, but in all, it looks like 4 people have died, and police were injured, and there's been 50-something arrests. I hope more, because it's treasonous. As a former military member, you cannot say that you support the U.S. and the Constitution when you try to interfere with constitutional proceedings. That's my opinion. Take it or leave it. That's my opinion. Actually, it's a fact. It's treason. That was something that I had pledged to defend, so I did learn a lot about the Constitution. The chances of actually overturning the election in a Democrat-controlled House, along with the majority of senators saying that they were not going to support opposing the results, and, of course, Pence not being able to reject the results, pretty much a moot point. We do know, as of this recording, that Congress did, in fact, certify the vote from the Electoral College. Joe Biden will be our 46th president. and will be inaugurated on January 20th. Now, what that inauguration is going to look like after this chaos at the Capitol, along with the COVID pandemic, the crowd sizes were already not going to be what they traditionally are, but this may be a whole new era of inauguration. We might not be, as the public, we might not be allowed because of what happened at the Capitol. We don't know. We'll have to wait and see. There were some whispers and rumors that there was talk of invoking the 25th Amendment, actually more specifically Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, which would mean that the vice president and the cabinet would declare Trump, quote, unable to discharge his powers and duties of office. If that happened, the vice president immediately becomes acting president. That's just rumors. That's just whispers. So all in all that said, Congress did what they initially set out to do. They certified the vote. Again, Joe Biden, 46th president of the United States. On a lighter note, some television shows I've been watching. I started watching The Imposters, which I think is a TNT show, but it's currently on Netflix. Also, I have been watching Bridgerton. I finished Bridgerton, and ASAP, I need season number 2. If there is going to be, please, Netflix, let there be a season 2. Also, Cobra Kai. The newest season was at season 3 of Cobra Kai is now on Netflix. That dropped on January 1st, so I caught up on that. Good stuff. So I'm going to finish Imposters and waiting for the 13th so that I can watch the new Night Stalker docuseries all about Richard Ramirez in Los Angeles. That's going to be a wild one. All right. Are you ready for it? So since Adam is not here, we're only going to have a B-side. But what a B-side it is.
This is Kevin Armstrong, your host for Movie Battle. Each episode, we take 2 films and put a superfan of each against one another to decide which one is best. The only rule we have is that you come correct. If you're interested in being a guest on Movie Battle, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter.
Not to get political again, but if you, of course, kept up with any parts of this past election, the presidential election, the election in Georgia, you'll recognize the name Stacey Abrams. Stacey Abrams pretty much single-handedly changed the course of things in Georgia. And you could say that this is a case for this woman. No, we're not doing a case about Stacey Abrams, but someone that you could say is the past equivalent of Stacey Abrams. Stacey Abrams of the 60s. This is the story of Alberta Jones. And this is a story that 115, 120, 150% needs to be shared. Not only because she's an amazing, incredible force, but attention needs to be brought to her case. Alberta Jones is the civil rights pioneer that almost no one knows about, and it's unreal because of the amount of things she did in her short life. Some quick highlights. She was Louisville's first female black prosecutor. She negotiated a major contract for a sports figure that we'll talk about in a second. She registered thousands of black voters in the 60s. And she paved the way for a ban on racial discrimination by local theaters and lunch counters. Sadly, Alberta's name is absent from the annals of civil rights martyrs in the 60s, and reasons for that are unknown. Like I said, she's the civil rights pioneer you probably never heard of. There's no clear evidence that her death was racially or politically motivated, but let's be real. When you hear the story, you'll have your own opinions, and I'd love to hear what they are. Louisville, at the time of her death, was on the dividing line between the North and the South, and they largely avoided a lot of the extreme violence of the era, like the church bombings and the murder of civil rights workers, Alberta excluded. So it doesn't have the immediate resonance of the era, like when you mention Birmingham or Selma. All right, so let's get into the story of Alberta Jones. So Alberta was born November 12th, 1930, to Sarah Sadie Frances Crawford and Odell Jones in Louisville, Kentucky, right down the road. And that's another reason I'm so amazed I haven't heard this story, because it's so close. All right, so Alberta attended Louisville Central High School and the Louisville Municipal College for Negroes, which is known as LMC at the time. Well, in 1951, LMC merged with the University of Louisville. She graduated third in her class, in the entire class, the entire graduating college class. In 1956, Alberta became the first African American to attend the University of Louisville Law School. Amazing. In 56, a Black female. In her second year, she transferred to Howard University School of Law. Hey, interesting side note, I almost went to Howard myself. She graduated fourth in her class from Howard in 1958, and the next year she became one of the first African American women to pass the bar in Kentucky, in the entire state of Kentucky. In 1959, she came back to Louisville after graduating from Howard University School of Law, and she opened up her very own law office in downtown Louisville, which at the time, Louisville was still deeply segregated. Black people couldn't even enter movie theaters or restaurants in the city's commercial heart in the downtown district. They couldn't even try on clothes at department stores. So this was a major feat that she was able to open a law office in the downtown area. Alberta lived in Louisville's majority Black area, the West End, with her mom and her sister, just a couple of blocks from a young man named Cassius Clay. In 1960, Cassius, who eventually goes on to become somebody you may have heard of, a major force in not just boxing, but political world as well, Muhammad Ali. Cassius actually hired Alberta to represent him when he turned professional as a boxer. Give that a thought for a moment. He hired a Black female in 1960 to represent him as he turned professional as a boxer. She negotiated a contract for him with 11 white millionaire men, known as the Louisville Sponsoring Group. Alberta, deep with insight for the future and very protective of her client, insisted that 15% of his winnings be held in trust until he turned 35, and she served as the trustee. Today, that contract hangs on the wall of the Muhammad Ali Center in Louisville. And I am so bummed that when I went to the Muhammad Ali Center in Louisville, I did not look for this contract, because at the time I had no idea about Alberta Jones, and I'm really, really upset about that. And I am going to go back just to see this contract, because it is such a huge piece of history. Flora Shanklin is Alberta's sister, and she said that Alberta took Muhammad to buy a pink Cadillac at a downtown landmark called the Brown Brothers Cadillac dealership. Flora said that he used to come by the house and take my son and daughter to school in the car. I'm sure the kids love that. Alberta was also a member of the Falls City Bar Association, the Louisville Bar Association, and the American Bar Association. Alberta was also in a sorority. She was a member of Eta Zeta chapter of the Greek sorority Zeta Phi Beta. She also participated in the 1963 civil rights marches in Louisville and the March on Washington on August 28th of 1963. In her hometown of Louisville in 1960, Alberta became an advocate for increased African American political participation. She created the Independent Voters Association. That association registered 6,000 African Americans to vote. Now, think about today and the challenges people face in registering to vote today, and how we before the election we're like, make sure you're registered, make sure you're checking your registration, go out and vote. Today it's much, much easier, and it's still a challenge to get people registered. So imagine the challenges she faced in 1960 and was still able to get 6,000 African Americans registered. She rented voting machines, and she held classes in her office on how to vote for your candidate. Her efforts resulted in a major political shakeup in 1961 when Black voters helped to oust the mayor and many of the city's aldermen. Think Georgia, Stacey Abrams, a major political shakeup in Georgia. Same thing happened in Louisville, thanks to Alberta Jones. 2 years later, the administration in this city enacted the very first public accommodations ordinance in the South, outlawing racial discrimination in businesses, meaning now blacks could go downtown and try on clothes and go to theaters and go to restaurants because of Alberta Jones. Alberta said in an interview with the Courier-Journal in 1965, "We taught the Negroes how to use the voting machine." Shortly after that, she became a city prosecutor, the first woman of any race to hold that position in the city of Louisville. She said in that same interview, "When I got back home, a lot of people said, 'You've got 2 strikes against you. You're a woman and you're a Negro.' And she responded by saying, 'Yeah, I still have 1 strike left, and I've seen people get some home runs when all they've got is 1 strike left.'" If that's not the most epic reply to shade being thrown at you, I love it. So now, with considerable political influence, in 1964, Alberta was appointed city attorney in Louisville, becoming the first woman of any race to hold that position. In February 1965, Alberta was appointed prosecutor for the Domestic Relations Court. Again, the first woman of any race and the first person of color to hold that position, which meant that Alberta was responsible for prosecuting mostly white men for spousal abuse. In the 60s, she was putting white men in jail for beating their wives, a black female. I keep stressing that because this is a huge, huge deal. It's still a big deal in 2021. So imagine years ago when they basically had just gotten, she had to fight for desegregation, and now she's putting white men in jail for beating their wives. Alberta was also active in the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Another cause that Alberta was really outspoken for was the fundraising efforts to pay the medical bills of a young man named James Bucky Welch. You see, young James, at the age of 7, lost both of his arms while trying to rescue his puppy from a moving train. Bucky was actually made the honorary commander of the Ohio Valley Rescue Squad, and with help and donations from people like Muhammad Ali and several others, thanks to Alberta, she was able to purchase prosthetic arms for little Bucky. She raised $10,000, which today would be close to about $83,000 that she raised. Just a few months after Alberta began working as the special prosecutor, she was killed. On August 5th of 1965, Alberta's body was found in the Ohio River. Her body had been thrown off the Louisville-Sherman-Minton Bridge near an amusement park in the West End. Alberta was 34 years old at the time of her death. She had been pulled from her rental car and beaten in the head with a brick until she lost consciousness, and then her body was thrown over into the river where she drowned. Her rental car, she had been driving because her car was in the shop, was found a few blocks away from the bridge with blood in the back seat, and her purse was found hanging from the bridge. 3 years later, not the day that her body was found, not the day that the car was found, 3 years after her death, that's when her purse was found hanging from that bridge. Somebody held on to her purse, obviously because it was evidence, for 3 years. On the night of her murder, witnesses say they saw 2 black males drag a screaming woman into the back seat of a car that looked like a Ford Fairlane. And that's exactly what Alberta was driving at the time of her death. A large quantity of blood stained the back seat. Witnesses later recalled seeing a body being tossed into the river by 3 unidentified men at the bridge. As we mentioned earlier, Alberta lived with her mom and her sister, and they said she was pretty much a homebody. She didn't really go out much at night. Her sister said when I went upstairs about 10 to go to bed, she was sitting on the couch reading about the assassination of President Kennedy. Flora said in an interview, when I woke up the next morning, Alberta was not in her bed. I went downstairs and I asked my mother where Alberta was, and Mom said, I've been laying in my bed the whole night wondering that. Alberta, according to Alberta and Flora's mom, had received a call late that night from a friend named Gladys Wyckoff, who asked Alberta to meet her to talk about a lawsuit that she wanted against a beautician. Alberta told Gladys I don't do that. That's not what I do anymore. I'm a prosecutor. I don't handle that kind of a lawsuit. And Gladys, knowing she would rattle Alberta's chain, Flora said, Gladys told her, since you have this new job, you got uppity. Of course, Gladys's comment got to Alberta, guilted her. Alberta, who was well educated, did not want her friends to think that she had gotten uppity, so she decided to go and meet with Gladys. Flora said that their mother, Sadie, asked if she wanted her to go with Alberta, and Alberta said, no, that's fine, I'll be okay. That was the last they saw and heard from Alberta. The next morning, when Alberta hadn't returned home, Flora called Gladys's house. Gladys's daughter answered the phone and said, oh, Mom's downtown taking care of some business. Flora said, there's no businesses open at 7 o'clock in the morning. I know Alberta came there last night and we haven't seen her since. Tell your mom to call me back. Gladys never returned the call. So by 8:30, when they hadn't heard from Alberta, when Gladys hadn't called back, Flora said she called the safety director of the police department and said, Alberta is missing. An investigation started. One theory that was pursued after Alberta's death was that her death was the responsibility of the Nation of Islam because leader, remember, Muhammad Ali converted to Islam nation, and the nation's leader, Elijah Muhammad, was said to have wanted that 15% of Muhammad's earnings that Alberta managed. A detective that was working the case at the time, who also happened to be black, was interviewed in the 80s and said that while he was pursuing this angle, his wife received death threats. A gentleman by the name of Sergeant Owen, who worked on the case when it was reopened, said the Nation of Islam theory has never been substantiated. He said, I haven't seen any evidence to indicate that aside from hearsay. So that's an avenue that wasn't pursued. The FBI did find a fingerprint inside of Alberta's car in the initial investigation. It belonged to a man who was 17 at the time, but 2 years later, it took 2 years, prosecutors decided not to pursue the case, citing deaths of key witnesses. In 2008, this young man admitted to detectives that he did used to hang out in a park with friends that was 1 block from where the car was found. The only piece of evidence that still exists is that fingerprint. All other physical evidence from 1965 has been lost. Despite the fingerprints and the witnesses, this tragic, brutal murder from August 5th of 1965 of Alberta Jones is still unsolved. Flora, again, Alberta's sister, is still alive and living in Louisville. She's in her 80s, and she said, because things were still so segregated in Louisville then, I believe if she'd been a white woman prosecutor, they would have turned over heaven and hell to solve this. But she was black. They didn't do anything about it. Flora believes that whoever murdered Alberta was paid by others. She said, I don't know who, but she stepped on some toes. Flora recalled Alberta saying that she was regularly harassed by a white court officer at work. Flora said that Alberta told her that one day she got so frustrated with him that she hit him with her briefcase. Now, I couldn't find any more details, so I don't know the type of harassment. I don't know if it was sexual or racial or maybe a combination. My guess is it probably was a bit of a combination. She was a very attractive female, smart, also working as a prosecutor, prosecuting white males. She probably upset and angered some of them. That's another theory, along with this court officer. Of course, you've got that Nation of Islam theory. Also, it could have just been angry white supremacists at the time. There's so many theories here. And without that key evidence, it's just, it's a case that unbelievably is still unsolved. So this case actually received some revitalization by a woman named Lee Remington, who began a research project for a biography while she was in school. The more Lee learned about this case, the more she became desperate to discover what no one else had learned. Who was responsible for the death of Alberta Jones in 1965? So Lee was intrigued by this case while she was studying as a law student at Brandeis University at the University of Louisville. Lee said in an interview, "I was in a hallway. They had portraits of Kentucky civil rights leaders, and she was the only African-American woman on the wall. I stopped to read the inscription, and it talked about her work with the civil rights movement. At the bottom, it said she was murdered, and it was unsolved." This sat with Lee for years. Lee went on to become a professor at Bellarmine University, and in 2013, she immersed herself in research on Alberta's life. She said, "I called her sister. I found her online. We became close. The more I found out about the case, the more I wondered whether it was more than just a book project." Lee went through thousands and thousands of pages of files, and she found evidence that the police seemed to have ignored in the case. She found, now remember, the police said that witnesses had died. Lee found that those witnesses, in fact, were not dead. The book project evolved into a quest for justice for Alberta. A friend of Alberta's family gave Lee police records that he had obtained himself from an open records request. Lee said, "In 10 minutes, I found 2 major discrepancies in the records. They said all the detectives who worked in the case were dead. Not true." She immediately located one of the detectives, his name Carl Corder, who had collected the evidence in 1965. She said, "I called him. He was very much alive. He invited me to his house." And she said, "I got to sit down and interview him. He was a young detective at the time, and he had overseen much of the collection of the evidence. Where that evidence went, who knows?" In 2017, Alberta Jones, the case of Alberta Jones was reopened, and it was funded by the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act, which provides $13 million annually to the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the states and local law officials to investigate and prosecute pre-1970 murders. Still to this day, as of this recording, in 2021, they have never developed a dominant theory about suspects or motive. Sergeant Owen, who is the current investigator, said that the case is open. Sergeant Carr, who also works on the case, he's in the Louisville homicide unit, he said in an interview with the Washington Post, the case is still active. He said homicides remain open until there's an arrest made or a clearance of some sort. Neither has happened, so the case is still open. The unsolved case from over 50 years ago. Sergeant Carr says they have worked tirelessly on this case. The case is not closed. I don't know if tirelessly is the word I would use, but at least it's still not closed. Hopefully, one day, there will be a resolution to this case, and we will find justice for Alberta Jones. A Louisville civic group hung a giant banner with Alberta's portrait on a bank building, the River City Bank, on Muhammad Ali Boulevard. It joined other portraits downtown honoring prominent people with Louisville roots, including Diane Sawyer, Jennifer Lawrence, and Colonel Harlan Sanders, Mr. KFC. Flora and Lee raised $8,000 to create the banner. Lee is hoping that the banner will spark someone's memory, or maybe it'll just hit on someone's conscience about what happened to Alberta, and someone will come forward. Lee said she spent her whole life fighting for others. It's time that somebody started fighting for her. And that, my dear desktop detective friends, is the unsolved case of civil rights pioneer, attorney, and all-round amazing badass, Alberta Jones. Thanks for joining us this week. Of course, next week we'll have another episode, and hopefully Adam will be back. Again, if you'd like to support the show, you can do that several ways. buymeacoffee.com/A-side-B-side-pod. Merch, masks available on the website. We're still wearing masks. Yes, we are. We're still wearing masks and social distancing. You can do that. Merch of all kinds. We've got t-shirts, sweatshirts, masks, puzzles, blankets, all of that on our website, asidebsidepodcast.square.site. We'd love to hear from you if you have a case. Adam was actually we were going to switch sides, and Adam was going to present a hometown case. So if you've got a hometown homicide, or maybe you've just got a story you'd like to share, we'd love to hear from you. asidebsidepodcasts@gmail.com. You can get to us on Twitter, aside_bside_podcast. You can also, that's our Instagram. On Twitter, it's asidebsidepod. So Twitter, asidebsidepod. Instagram is aside_bside_podcast. You can DM us. You can email us. You can even leave us a voicemail that we may feature on the show on our Anchor page. All kind of ways to interact with you, and we would love to hear from you. Thank you so much. Don't forget that gut instinct, it's telling you something. It's okay to think they're creepy because they probably are. Bad vibes save lives. Thanks. As always, thank you for listening to A-Side, B-Side podcast. If you enjoy the show, please, if you don't mind, head on over to Apple and leave us a rating or a review. And if you'd like to continue to support the podcast, you can do so by heading on over to Patreon, or you can buy us a coffee, as well as buying merch on our website, asidebsidepodcast.square.site. From Adam and I at A-Side, B-Side podcast, please remember to wear your mask, social distance if you're around people that don't live in your household, and just be safe and happy. Thanks again from us here at A-Side, B-Side podcast.